We'll turn our discussion to the heavy metal music in the 1980s. When I say the early days of heavy metal, you may think that I mean to go back to the late 1960s, the early 1970s, because now, since heavy metal became so popular and so mainstream by the end of the 80s, we tend to look back into the 70s and into the late 60s and call a lot of music heavy metal because it seems to share a lot of characteristics with the music that we're used to from the 80s and into the 90s. But the fact is that heavy metal music didn't really begin to separate itself out from other blues-based rock music really until the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s, just at about the time that rock music itself was changing so much at the end of the 70s with what we called corporate rock. Some people would think of it as sort of the staples of classic rock, but what was happening at the end of the 70s, it was at that point that heavy metal really began to separate itself out as something different or something aside or something that wanted its own distinctiveness from this other kind of music. So as we talk about the early heavy metal in this lecture, we're really talking about the music that comes out of the late 70s and the first half of the 1980s. Groups having some commercial success, but there are a lot of heavy metal groups and heavy metal scenes with groups that just sort of bubbled under the charts and never really sort of had the success, at least never had the kind of success that heavy metal bands would have in the second half of the 1980s. Considering heavy metal from the very beginning, we have to wonder, where does this term come from? A lot of heavy metal musicians don't actually like heavy metal. I know Ozzy Osbourne has said a number of times, what exactly does heavy metal mean? It isn't really a very sort of flattering or interesting or descriptive kind of term. Where did it come from? There's the Steppenwolf song, Born to Be Wild, heavy metal thunder. So people say, well, maybe that's where the heavy metal thing comes from. Of course, in that song, they're really talking about motorcycles and the heavy metal thunder that comes from those. In terms of style, some of the prototypes for heavy metal music, you might be able to go back as far as, say, something like Iron Butterfly's In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida from 1968, the kind of really heavy sound of that track. You may want to go to Detroit and the MC5 and Iggy Pop. You may want to sort of refer to the sort of aggressive sound of a lot of the garage bands from the mid and late 1960s. Probably the most obvious place to start with the roots of heavy metal is with Black Sabbath. There's a group that, of course, has Ozzy Osbourne in it, and by the end of the decade and into the early 1980s, both Ozzy and Black Sabbath without Ozzy become important figures in the growth of heavy metal as a separate kind of genre. But back in the 70s, Black Sabbath really were, as we talked about before, kind of grouped in with bands like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and other groups. Well, those are a couple of other groups that might be seen as prototypes. They weren't yet heavy metal they weren't yet thought of as heavy metal in the 70s, but became prototypes for heavy metal music. Black Sabbath for its gothic horror themes. Remember that the whole idea of calling the band Black Sabbath was using a name from a Boris Karloff horror film from the 1960s. The sort of dark sound that a lot of the music has, where all of the instruments, the bass, guitar, the voice, are all really pretty much doing exactly the same line. So if you listen to a song like, say, for example, Iron Man, they're all basically doing that same melody with some elaboration. It's a very dark, sort of slow, brooding kind of sound. Of course, they could do more up-tempo things, and certainly that happens in a lot of their tunes too, but you get the idea of this sort of dark, gothic horror kind of a theme. A Deep Purple for the virtuosity of Ritchie Blackmore on the lead guitar, a very important prototype for heavy metal. The classical references, courtesy of keyboardist John Lord. Most of those classical references actually to more like Baroque music, that is music of people like J.S. Bach, not so much to Mozart or Beethoven or Schumann or Brahms or something like that, but very much sort of Baroque influences. The lead vocals in Deep Purple, Ian Gillan, and that sort of high scream that he patented very early on becomes prototypical for heavy metal vocalists. Led Zeppelin are often cited as a prototype. Jimmy Page would say, well, don't forget, Led Zeppelin had an awful lot of acoustic music, and it was always sort of bugged him a bit that they're always remembered for the heavier stuff. But certainly, when Led Zeppelin were heavy, they were very heavy. Is there anything sort of heavier than Kashmir? It's a big, gigantic, sort of spectacular but hard-driving kind of piece that would have influenced and inspired a lot of heavy metal musicians. And then the theatrical elements that were part of an Alice Cooper or a Kiss show really start to become part of heavy metal as heavy metal gets into the bigger venues, into the stadiums and that kind of thing. So all these things kind of blend together as influences. And so heavy metal starts to become a kind of specialty within rock music by the end of the 70s and the early 80s. Let's talk a little bit about the image of heavy metal in the culture. Heavy metal, it was a style. You can decide what you think, how you think things are today. But back in the day, and really even into the 90s, heavy metal fans and heavy metal musicians did not get much respect. The music was thought of as being very simple-minded. The people who listened to it were thought of as being not particularly sophisticated. It was partly because the music was marked as very kind of blue-collar and working class, and so a lot of people sort of looked down on those kinds of folks anyway, right? And so the music that went with it came with all these kinds of associations, people who weren't very sophisticated, who were prone to violence, not your more sort of sophisticated music listener, let's say. They were often called headbangers because of the way they would bang their heads, during the music, this kind of thing. And actually, among the heavy metal people, was a term that they adopted with some affection. They were happy to be called headbangers. There were both positive and negative stereotypes associated with heavy metal. There are two places where we can see these illustrated in the culture most clearly. The kind of honesty, loyalty, but yet unselfish devotion to partying can be seen in Wayne and Garth of the Wayne's World movies. They are the lovable heavy metal fans. They're maybe not the smartest, not the sharpest knife in the drawer, either one of them, but down deep, they're good, honest, earnest people who, even though they like to party, are good folks. The more negative stereotypes are captured in the cartoon series Beavis and Butthead. And these two guys are ignorant, vulgar, and lazy. One of them wearing a Metallica t-shirt, I think, and the other one wearing a Winger t-shirt, And so the whole idea there is this is sort of like the negative stereotype of not so much the heavy metal musician as much as the heavy metal fan. And then you see both of them. And they become this sort of iconic imagery that rises up in the 80s and really sticks with us now and can still be used to some effect in movies and television shows to sort of indicate a whole kind of personality, a whole sort of place in the culture. So that gives us some idea of how heavy metal music is seen in the culture. Let's talk about how it rises. The rise of heavy metal can be seen happening in two places. In this country, in the United States, centered around Los Angeles, most importantly, and in the UK, centered around both London and also the north of England. Let's talk about the British scene first. There's a movement called the New Wave of British Heavy Metal, NWBHM, as it's sometimes abbreviated. And within British heavy metal, the touchstone really is early Black Sabbath. And when we think about what was happening with Black Sabbath at the end of the 70s into the 80s, by 1977, Ozzy Osbourne had left Black Sabbath and to go solo. Sabbath tried a couple of singers, but eventually replaced him with Ronnie James Dio. And they came out with a couple of big albums with Dio on lead vocals, Heaven and Hell in 1980 and Mob Rules in 1981. Ozzy recruits virtuoso guitarist Randy Rhoads into his band, and he comes screaming back as a solo album, as a solo artist with Blizzard of Oz in 1980. That was a #2 album in this country, #7 in the UK, and Diary of a Madman in 1981. So on the biggest stage, you've got Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne both kind of leading the way. But underneath that, there are some groups that were really pushing the aesthetic of getting back to just heavy metal, getting away from all of this big production that had happened with the progressive rock bands and Pink Floyd and all this kind of thing, and just really getting down to the sort of the core of what heavy metal was. An important group for that, coming out of Birmingham, is Judas Priest. In 1979, their album Hellbent for Leather is usually considered a classic of this new wave of British heavy metal. From 1980, we get the album British Steel and the two classic tracks, Breaking the Law and Living After Midnight. Coming out of London, we get Iron Maiden, very popular in the UK, this group. Their initial album from 1980, and then Number of the Beast was number 33 in this country, but number 1 in the UK in 1982. Coming out of Sheffield, Def Leppard, 1981, their album High and Dry, and then 1983, their big album in this country, Pyromania, number 2 here, number 18 in the UK, maybe the representative track from that being a track called Photograph. And then a group that was very influential but never really had the success in this country that some of the other groups had, and that's Motorhead, coming out of London and led by bassist, vocalist Lemmy Kilmister. Ace of Spades from 1980 is probably the most representative of the Motorhead stuff, but Lemmy and his bands were very influential on a lot of the other new wave of British heavy metal bands. Some of the features that all of this music share, of course, an obviously very guitar-driven sound, virtuosic guitar solos, and unrelentingly heavy drum beats. That is, the drums are heavy, a la sort of John Bonham. The guitar solos are virtuosic, a la Ritchie Blackmore, a la their American cousin Eddie Van Halen, people like that, where the solos, the guitar solos, really are the kind of showcases oftentimes of these tracks. Let's turn now to Los Angeles and see what was happening over on this side of the pond. If you went to if you were an American kid wanting to play guitar in the popular music business in this country, in the United States, at the end of the 70s, you probably ended up going to Los Angeles. That's where everybody ended up. It used to be New York, maybe, but by the end of the 70s, it was Los Angeles. Everybody, so you had this, it's like every guitar player in the country was in Los Angeles. And so part of that was, fighting for to get into groups and various kinds of things. So there was a lot of musicians and a lot of musicianship in Los Angeles, people fighting to be part of the music biz. And this has really provided a very sort of fertile ground for a lot of these heavy metal groups that rose up. One group that sort of led the way, Van Halen, we've already talked about, and we talked about rock in the late 1970s. Their album from 1978, their debut album, Van Halen, with David Lee Roth on lead vocals. But they did their last album with David Lee Roth, their 6th studio album, in 1984, called appropriately 1984. And then because of a falling out between Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth and tension in the group, these kinds of things happen all the time, right? David Lee Roth leaves, and in comes Sammy Hagar for the Sammy Hagar version of Van Halen. The first album they did together, 5150, was number 1 in 1986 with the number 3 single, Why Can't This Be Love? I'll leave it to you to decide whether you like the David Lee Roth Van Halen or the Sammy Hagar Van Halen better, but whatever you decide, it has to be acknowledged that Van Halen coming out of Los Angeles is an important influence on that scene. Some other groups coming out of the LA scene sort of early on in the first half of the decade, Quiet Riot, their album from 1983, Metal Health, featuring the song Come On, Feel the Noise, a number 5 single for them, so some commercial success there. A song that had originally been done in the 70s by a British group called Slade. Rat, Out of the Cellar from 1984, a number 7 album for them, featuring the single Round and Round, which was a number 12 single. And Motley Crue, featuring singer Vince Neil and drummer Tommy Lee, who would become famous for something entirely different on the internet some years later. With the 2 big albums, one from 1983, Shout at the Devil, that was number 17 for them in 83, and their big one from the end of the decade, Dr. Feelgood, number 1 on the pop charts here, number 4 in the UK. Some of the musical features of LA metal, very similar in a lot of ways to the metal that comes out of the UK. High screaming vocals, maybe an imitation of somebody like Robert Plant. The very highest screams maybe in imitation of Deep Purple's Ian Gillan. Loud, assertive drumming. Again, we come back to the big beats, the big drum sound. Oftentimes drummers with lots of drums and cymbals, a la somebody like Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. The drum kit is essentially this, almost like a sort of an airline cockpit with all kinds of drums that guys can hit. And a lot of unison, anthem-like vocals in the choruses of the songs, setting the stage for kind of stadium sing-along. So when you get to the chorus of the song, it's almost like the whole crowd can raise their fist and sing along in a kind of sing-along kind of way. Well, in the next video, let's talk about what happens toward the middle and the end of the decade as heavy metal leaves this relatively undergroundish, or at least somewhat off the radar kind of status, and becomes one of the dominant styles of the decade.